Hi everyone, and welcome back to my channel. This is Icarus, and today we are finally getting back to Whipping Girl, this time chapter 8. And I'll do my usual disclaimer in a second. I have to say, out of the 8 chapters I've read so far, this is the one that I have the least problems with. And you will find out very soon, because it's called Dismantling Cissexual Privilege, which does bring me to my disclaimer. So, this book was written in 2005, published in 2007, so there's going to be some outdated terminology, such as cissexual. We no longer really use that, we say cisgender, but I like to make it obvious that just because some of the language, like the terminology being used in this book, is outdated, that doesn't mean that the actual knowledge behind it is. No, the actual knowledge that Serrano brings to a lot of the work is her own experiences being presented as fact, which is why I have such an issue with it. If there is older terminology that is confusing, I do try to explain it a bit. I have gone into that in previous videos. But we've got Dismantling Sexual Privilege. As I said, it's the one that I may agree with her the most on. So, despite that, I still have some commentary. The very first sentence is, until now, discourses on transsexuality have invariably relied on language and concepts invented by clinicians, researchers, and academics who have made transsexuals the objects of their inquiry. In such a framework, transsexual bodies, identities, perspectives, and experiences are continuously required to be explained and inevitably remain open to interpretation. And yes, I do immediately disagree with her on something, because it's like, the inevitably remain open to interpretation is actually really bugs me, because all gender experiences, all of these experiences remain open to interpretation. It's gender and sexuality and what it is to be human, even, ends up being a really personal thing. I think that's where we get the philosophy discussions of is everything real around us? Do we just imagine it? Like, concretely, we know that everything around us exists, but then you go into like psychotic disorders. Are my delusions real, or are they just figments of my imagination? Are the individuals with dissociative identity disorder, their fragmented personalities, are each one of them real, or are they based off of the core personality? Like, how do we determine what is real, what is not? Because everything is so subjected to our individual experiences. So yeah, I have an issue with her very first sentence, because everything is open to interpretation. That's actually part of science, which I love, and philosophy, which I love. And I think the only thing that isn't so subject to it is math, which I hate. So, is there a correlation? Maybe. I don't know. I guess we'll never know. Anyway, so the next sentence is, corresponding cissexual attributes are simply taken for granted. They are assumed to be natural and normal, and therefore escape reciprocal critique. This places transsexuals at a constant disadvantage, since we have generally been forced to rely on limiting cissexual-centric terminology to make sense of our own lives. And I don't really have anything to say about that. I just, in the conjunction with the very first sentence, because this is the same paragraph, it annoys me. Skipping on down a bit, this perspective has led transgender activists to primarily focus their attention on opposing binary gender norms, particularly those that place limitations on one's gender expression and appearance, and to celebrate and create cultural space for those who defy, transcend, or fail to identify within the male-female binary. And then going on, transgender rhetoric favors the perspectives of those who identify outside the male-female binary, whereas most transsexuals typically identify within it, and those whose gender expression and appearance does not conform to the binary, whereas transsexuals typically cite the discrepancy between their subconscious sex and physical sex as a major obstacle in their lives. So, I did make a note of, why are you bitching about this a few chapters earlier? You hated being put into the fem box, and now you're demanding it. I'll go on that in a second. This is where some of the older language is pertinent. So when she is talking about transgender people, she is including anyone that we would consider today to be trans, either binary or non binary or somewhere in between. Whereas the transsexual is specifically binary trans people. And yeah, this irritated me because she's talking about how transgender activists primarily focus on people who are outside the binary and opposing binary norms. And then just a few chapters ago, she was talking about how she's not a typically feminine woman. She is a woman, so she does have some feminine traits that she acknowledges she has, but she doesn't like makeup. She doesn't like dressing up in like sparkly pink clothes and dresses. But now she's kind of ignoring the fact that feminism has worked so hard to allow women to not fit into a very narrow presentation of femininity. And I think it bothers me because once again, she's viewing things from a very specific lens and she's taking a lot for granted. So she's viewing things from her personal lens and taking a lot of stuff for granted, including all the work that feminism has done to like allow women to wear jeans and allow women to not have to wear makeup. And yes, there still is pushback against women from doing those things, but generally speaking, it's more accepted for a woman to wear pants and not wear makeup than it is for a man to wear a dress and wear makeup. So this argument of like how transsexuals care about one thing and the transgender people care too much about this other thing, but she's ignoring the fact that women actually have been fighting to fall out of these binary stereotypes, and then she's also been complaining about binary stereotypes earlier and complaining about a really good movie, all that stuff. So let's go on to the next. While I believe that creating space for people who exist outside of the male-female binary remains a cause worth fighting for, those of us who are transsexual must begin to simultaneously develop our own language and concepts that accurately articulate our unique experiences and perspectives and to fill in the many gaps that exist in both gatekeeper and transgender activist language. Before describing how cissexual privilege is practiced and justified, we must address two under-acknowledged yet crucial aspects of social gender that enable cissexual privilege to proliferate yet remain invisible: gendering and cissexual assumption. So the gendering and cissexual assumption is going to be what is coming up next. But I wanted to highlight the first sentence. This is like the last paragraph. I skipped a sentence. It doesn't matter. So that besides the fact that the sentence is a run-on that rivals my run-ons, the ability for her to avoid using the word but, like I'm not a racist, but she's doing the while I believe that non-binary experiences need to be talked about more, instead of saying but, she's like those of us. And I don't see, it's still basically a but sentence. And I don't see how her viewing non-binary identities and her viewing non-binary gender expressions, of which I would still argue that some of the now more accepted presentations that women can have, wearing jeans, sweatshirts, not having to be, 1950s all dolled up sort of shit, is still a sort of non-binary gender expression. I could get into that. I'm not. I'm just going to leave that sentence there because otherwise this will go on too long. But they're not mutually exclusive. The language that binary trans people and non-binary trans people can have a lot of overlap, including stuff like transandrophobia, transmisogyny. If you are a femme-aligned non-binary person or a masculine-aligned non-binary person, you do have a lot of overlap with how those identities intersect with both being trans and cisgender. And I would say agender or gender neutral non-binary people would still experience some of those expectations and stuff because unfortunately your going to passively look at a person and you're going to assume, oh, that's a woman, that's a man. Except for that one episode of Bones where no one could figure it out, so they were making bets, and that was weird. The entire episode was weird. So yes, the rest of the chapter is basically be going over like how cissexual or cisgender privilege like gets subconsciously done. Alright, so the next section is called gendering, and the very first sentence is most of us want to believe that the act of distinguishing between women and men is a passive task, that all people naturally fall into one of two mutually exclusive categories, male and female, that we observe the natural states in an unobtrusive, objective manner. And I just talked about the Bones episode, but it's worth repeating. There's a character, I believe a Japanese person, came over as a consult or to just work with Bones for something. Everyone sort of assumed their gender, but they got conflicting information, started talking about what's this person's gender. At the end of the episode, it was revealed that supposedly this person is a man because they have a penis. That's the gist of it. It's been a hot minute since I've watched it. And continuing on, Serrano says, however, this is not the case. Distinguishing between women and men is an active process, and we do it compulsively. If you have any doubt about this, simply observe how quickly you determine other people's genders. It happens instantaneously. I wholeheartedly disagree with her on this. And this is why I said that while this chapter is better than her others, she's still very much putting her experiences onto everyone else. And the thing is, I wouldn't even say that gendering someone is a compulsion. It's more just you are so used to the two ends of the bimodal spectrum that it's just a natural response. And it's not an active, but it's a passive response that takes active work to undo. Sort of like how I lived in Alabama. I did consider myself more or less not racist, but then I actually moved to Philadelphia and I realized I still had these biases that I needed to unlearn. And the same thing for gender. You act upon what you know. And the sooner you learn about, like, say, non-binary identities, like if you learn about them when you're a kid and you're surrounded by them when you're a kid, it's going to be a much more passive process for you to be like, I'm not assuming anyone's gender. I'm going to ask them about it. Versus, like, people my age who may not have had very good access to this sort of thing will have to actively undo their passive subconscious thought. So I completely disagree with her. I don't think gendering is an active process unless you're in the process of unlearning automatically assuming someone's gender. Then she goes on to say, not only that, but we tend to make the call one way or another no matter how far away a person is or how little evidence we have to go by. While we may like to think of ourselves as being passive observers, in reality we are constantly and actively projecting our ideas and assumptions about maleness and femaleness onto every person we meet. Again, I do agree with her on this. The only thing is, I don't think that this is an active process. I think we just assume the entire world works like we do, so we project that process onto other people. It's very much why the right-leaning folks think that left-leaning people are forcing their kids to transition and be trans and that sort of thing, because they're used to trying to make their kids do what they want. So they assume everyone does that. It's a worldview bias. But I disagree that this is a active process. At least not an active process, as she was saying at first, where you are actively, compulsively doing this to people. I think it's just bad language. I really think this is bad language in this section because inherently I agree with her. I just disagree that this is something we are actively thinking about doing. Moving on to the next section, recognizing the ubiquitous nature of this phenomenon calls into question most definitions of gender itself. We can argue all we want about what defines a woman or a man, whether it's genes, chromosomes, brain structure, genitals, socialization, or the legal sex on a birth certificate or driver's license. But the truth is, these factors typically play no role whatsoever in how we gender people in everyday circumstances. Typically, we rely primarily on secondary sex characteristics: body shape and size, skin complexion, facial and body hair, voice, breasts, etc. And to a lesser extent, gender expression and gender roles, the person's dress, mannerisms, etc. I will refer to the gender we are assigned by other people as our perceived sex or perceived gender. So I highlighted this passage because I just agree with it. That's all I have to say about that. That is, we do judge someone's sex or gender not based off of anything that is like quantifiable via biology or science, but just how they look and present to us. Skipping on down. However, as a transsexual, I have been in numerous situations, particularly during my transition, where two or more people simultaneously came to different conclusions regarding my perceived gender. That is, one person assumed I was female, while another assumed I was male. That's a good way to understand the perceived gender. I've also found that people's experiences and preconceptions around gender dramatically affect the way they gender other people. For example, back when I identified as a male crossdresser, I found that I could pass as a woman rather easily in suburban areas, but in cities where people were presumably more aware of the existence of gender variant people, I would often be read as a cross-dressed male. Most cissexuals remain oblivious to the subjective nature of gendering, primarily because they themselves have not regularly had the experience of being misgendered, i.e., mistakenly assigned a gender that does not match one's identified gender. Unfortunately, this lack of experience usually leads to cissexuals to mistakenly believe that the process of gendering is a matter of pure observation, rather than the act of speculation that it is. And again, this is something I agree with, but it bothers me again that at the very start of this subchapter, she was talking about how this is an active process, and why I think this is just bad language at the start, because she and I are agreeing on stuff, but she's saying this is an active process. I'm saying this is a subconscious process. The next subheading is cissexual assumption. This occurs when a cissexual makes a common, albeit mistaken, assumption that the way they experience their physical and subconscious sexes, i.e., the fact that they do not feel uncomfortable with the sex they were born into, nor do they think themselves as, or wish they could become the other sex, applies to everyone else in the world. And after our transitions, many of us find that the cissexual majority simply assumes that we have always been members of our identified sex, thus making it impossible for us to be open about our trans status without constantly having to come out to others. Those are just two sections in a very short subheading. I read you the definition of cissexual assumption, where they just are like, my experiences are universal, and I think I talked about that, where people just assume their experiences are universal unless they are made to stop and think and realize that everyone experiences the world in a unique way. So the after our transitions, having to constantly come out. Okay, and I highlighted the second sentence because it once again feels like she is using weird wording. Like, I know there's a lot of talk about after transitioning, especially in older transgender communities, because they're honestly, I don't know why. I guess they assume, like, after they've been on HRT for X amount of time and they have been had their surgeries that they wanted and they're able to pass or whatever, they just assume that their transition has ended, even though they have to maintain a level of supplemental hormones. Maybe this is just a me thing, but I can't imagine transitioning ever ending. It's a constant process. But again, this is just seeing more of her assumptions on how other people deal with transitioning, whether they're passing or stealth or whatever. It does also ignore this idea that there are some transgender people who have to give up the idea of passing, because if they don't, then they are going to end up hurting themselves, because they will never be able to pass for their identified gender, and the trauma that can ensue from never being able to be seen as the gender they wish they were. It also lines up a lot with how I see younger trans people talking about other trans people who are upset that they weren't born as the gender that they see themselves as or the gender that they are. Because it's very easy to be like, no, I'm happy, I'm proud for my body, but it's also just as easy to be like, no, I hate everything about this. And I do think some of this anger is what has led us to having transmedicalism and true scum, where they're like, you have to have dysphoria to be trans, because once again, you're having people who are putting their experiences of gender onto others and their assumed experiences of gender onto others. So if you've never had dysphoria, how could you possibly be trans? Because you aren't hating your body. So it's once again, it's just she is taking a black and white. She's looking at someone's black issue, making it white, and there's so many shades of gray in between that I get annoyed with this book for being like an actual talk or being used as like a foundational piece of literature for the current trans movements, because at the end of the day, this is one individual's attempt to justify their beliefs. And then let's talk about the other than as a means to exercise cissexual privilege over them. So again, the cisgender privilege, the cissexual privilege is just, it hurts my brain to try and think about the many different ways she's using it. And it's just another reason why I don't like the term. Nettles that. I don't disagree about the cissexual ones are the one who create, foster, and enforce passing by their tendency to treat people in dramatically different ways based off of people's appearances. However, I think this is beyond just cis or trans, because trans people will be just as guilty as this as cis people. Look at Blair White. And I think it does a lot more for everyone involved and not just cis towards trans. It's not a black and white issue. This is something that affects everyone. Alright, next subsection. Taking one's gender for granted. Consider that people will talk about the fact that I now pass as a woman, but nobody ever asked about how difficult it must have been for me to pass as a man before. Personally, I found it infinitely more difficult and stressful to manage my perceived gender back when people presumed I was male than I do now as female. So she's using the term passing here and talking about how about people never wanting to talk about how hard it was to be seen as a dude or managing her perception of her gender when she was looking like a dude. And that's not how the word is used. So that's why no one is talking about it. And she's also like assuming everyone wants to talk about their experiences in the same way. And I just, cool, okay. That's not what passing means. And while physically transitioning and living in my identified sex has allowed me to finally overcome my gender dissonance, which, if you don't remember, gender dissonance is like your subconscious sex and your conscious sex not lining up, I still struggle with an intense hypersensitivity to gender, and more specifically to gendering, which explains why she's so pissed about Trans America. Like that entire section of taking one's gender for granted is just, this is me and I'm going to assume it's true for everyone. And again, that's what this entire chapter is about cis people saying, this is me and I'm going to assume it's true for everyone. But she's doing that. This entire book so far is, this is me, this is my feelings, this is true for everyone. And this is why I get so mad about this chapter, even though it's inherently, objectively not as bad as the other ones, because she's not talking about trans men for once. Distinguishing between transphobia and cissexual privilege. A cissexual butch dyke friend of mine shared with me an experience she had of being accused of being a man in a woman's restroom, presumably because of her masculine style of dress and mannerisms. The woman who made the accusation confronted her in a gender-entitled way by saying, "You don't belong here." My friend, who was obviously disturbed by the incident, responded by pointing to her own breast and saying, "I am a woman and I do belong here," which had the effect of making the accuser embarrassed and apologetic. While my friend does not identify as transgender, One could describe this incident as an example of transphobia. She was targeted because of her parents' transgressed gender norms. And that is the women getting beat up in the bathroom being affected by trans misogyny. Rather than reading all of that, because she just goes into a diatribe, I wanted to highlight that because it's like she is someone who today likes the words TME and TMA and does not think that they are fluid labels. And she goes down, for example, some queer women's events and establishments have policies that explicitly exclude trans women from attending. Proponents of such policies often claim they are not transphobic because they do allow some trans identified people to attend as long as they were born female. We've gone over this in a different chapter. She got mad. Those trans men or non binary AFAB people, I don't think I'd want to be friends with because they're not good people. Such policies may also be called transmisogynistic, as they favor female to male spectrum trans people over male to female spectrum trans people. Furthermore, these female born cissexuals, regardless of whether they are transgender identified, who choose to attend such events can be said as exercising their cissexual privilege, i.e., they are taking advantage of all the privileges associated with their female birth sex. Which explains where we get the bad L's and the TIR IRFs talking about how trans men have female privilege, which is gross. Once again, we see Serrano's work being used as a sort of foundation for being transandrophobic, and that is concerning to me. Once we understand cissexual privilege, it becomes evidence that many acts of discrimination that have previously been lumped under the term transphobia are probably better described in terms of cissexism. Now, I wouldn't disagree. I would say that cissexism is a little more complicated for people to understand, let alone say. Look at me trying to talk about this constantly. But I do think that they're not mutually exclusive. Speaking of exclusive, trans exclusion. Trans exclusion occurs when cissexuals exclude transsexuals from any spaces, organizations, or events designated for the trans person's identified gender. That's all I gotta say about that. Trans objectification. The objectification of transsexual bodies. Duh. While our physical transitions typically occur over a period of a few years, a mere fraction of our lives, not true for everyone, Serrano, so let's just move on, because once again, she's putting her experiences on top of everyone else. And again, she's a college-educated white woman who is around middle class, so yay. Transmystification. Transmystification is to allow oneself to become so caught up in the taboo of the nature of sex changes that one loses sight of the fact that transsexuality is a very real, tangible, and often mundane for those of us who experience it firsthand. One can see transmystification readily in media depictions of transsexuals, where assigned sex is often transformed into a hidden secret or plot twist, and our lived sex is distorted into an elaborate illusion. I don't really have anything to say about that. It's just, once again, we see why she hates Trans America so much. I also think that some of the younger trans people who are trying to encourage euphoria about being trans does a little bit of the transmystification, but in a different way. Instead of being caught up in the taboo of sex changes, it's more of the taboo of being different, which is something you also see being hurled around about being queer generally, or mental health issues, or physical disabilities. There's a sort of mystification that you are different, you're special, because you don't seem like everyone else, and it completely ignores the fact that fundamentally everyone is really different, but also fundamentally everyone is actually very similar to each other. You are no more special and no more abnormal than your next door neighbor. Trans interrogation. Trans interrogation focuses on the why. Why do transsexuals exist? Why are we motivated to change our sex? Is it due to genetics, hormones, upbringing, living in a plastic surgery-obsessed culture? Or maybe it's just a good old-fashioned mental disorder. Such questions represent the intellect section of objectifying transsexuals. Then she says, while I was working on Chapter 7, Pathological Science, immersing myself in sexological and sociological accounts that attempt to explain why transsexuals exist, it occurred to me that rather than simply removing the gender identity disorder diagnosis from the DSM, we should perhaps consider replacing it with a transsexual etiology disorder to describe the unhealthy obsession many cissexuals have with explaining the origins of transsexuality, which is gross. I disagree with it. I do think it'd be great if we do gender identity disorder, leave it from the DSM eventually, change the W path so it's a lot easier for people to access trans affirming care. I find this gross. It's one of those instances where we see someone being like, how about instead of pulling things up so that there's an equity, we literally just stomp over and become the ruling and oppressive class. That's all. From my preteen years through young adulthood, I was consumed with the question because, quite frankly, I didn't want to be transsexual. Like most people, I assumed that it was better to be cissexual. Eventually, I realized that dwelling on why was a pointless endeavor. The fact that I am transsexual and I exist, and there is no legitimate reason why I should feel inferior to a cissexual because of that. Once I accepted my own transsexuality, then it became obvious to me that the question, why do transsexuals exist, is not a matter of pure curiosity, but rather than an act of non-acceptance, as it invariably occurs in the absence of asking the reciprocal question, why do cissexuals exist? Here's why cissexuals exist. Because we as a species evolved to be mostly either male or female. And there are a combination of different reasons, from social issues to genetics to everything else in between, that causes a spectrum. We are bimodal. We mostly cluster on either side. The fact that there are people who do not identify with their binary gender, be them intersex, non-binary, whatever the reason, is just a part of human life. It's just a part of being an animal. It's just an evolutionary quirk in the system. Just like how you have the different colored moths, where some moths in a place that was really sooty, they started turning more sooty color, whereas moths in a place that wasn't sooty were more bark colored. It's just an evolutionary thing, and sometimes you'll have a sooty colored moth in the bark colored family and a bark colored moth in the other family. And because humans are, the Homo sapiens in particular, are a very social species, it means that we are able to help the people that may not fit in, either from personality disorders to developmental delays to physical disabilities. We are able to procreate and create more of us, and there's more evolutionary quirks. But the reason why cissexuals exist is because that is just part of nature. We are animals. That answers the question, why do transsexuals exist? Who knows? I don't know. I've stopped asking the why for myself because I've decided it just hurts me. And yeah, trying to constantly question why you couldn't be born the gender you see yourself as in your brain, it ends up hurting people. I don't think there's a problem with trying to ask the why, but I think trying to pinpoint one reason only is only detrimental to people as a whole. And I think this trying to flip it ignores the fact that we are animals and ignores the fact that cisgender people exist because evolutionary wise that made the most sense to us as a species to continue to procreate and make more of us, which is basically everything that evolution and everything else has to do. Alright, trans erasure. While all minority voices are silenced to a varying extent, usually by being denied access to media and economic and political power, there are several aspects of trans erasure that make it particularly extensive. First, as with all sexual minorities, oppositional sexism ensures that only a small percentage of trans people ever come out as transsexual. Second, those who come out often do so concurrently with their decision to physically transition, a process that has been historically regulated and severely limited by cissexual gatekeepers. We've already gone through all that in Chapter 7. I find it weird that she is, again, a college-educated, middle-class white woman in the U.S. who is talking about how, in particular, trans erasure is extensive and ubiquitous versus all other minority voices. Moving down a bit, but perhaps nothing facilitates trans erasure more than everyday gendering and cissexual assumptions. This suggests that most cissexuals never seriously consider the possibility that a certain percentage of the cissexual appearing people they see every day might actually be transsexual. International statistics indicate that a percentage of post-op transsexuals range from 1 to 3% of the population. While there are no rigorous statistics for the number of transsexuals in the U.S., estimates based on the number of sex reassignment surgeries performed suggest that at least 1 in 500 people in this country are transsexual. Several times more than that are transgender. In a world where people are viewed as being either female or male, and where all people are assumed to be cisgendered and cissexual, those of us who are transgendered and transsexual are effectively erased from public awareness. I agree and disagree. I already went into why I think this little section in itself is just, it's bad. As a white person who grew up middle class, it's just, no, don't talk about how you have the most insidious and prevalent type of minority erasure, because that puts you back into the oppression Olympics, and we know the oppression Olympics hurts everybody and helps no one. Changing gender perception, not performance, is the next subheading. These performance-centric models of gender can vary quite a bit, but they generally stress the idea that each of us actively creates gender differences by doing or performing gender in particular ways. According to this view, femaleness is not a natural state, but one that we reproduce when we call ourselves women, when we act, dress, and speak in what are considered feminine ways, and similarly for maleness. Some of the more extreme variations of this theory leave little room for intrinsic gender inclinations, leaning toward the notion that our gender and sexual identities are merely the unconscious repetitions of the socialization and gender norms that have been foisted upon us. Because many theorists and activists view gender performance as the means by which gender privileges, expectations, and restrictions are propagated in our culture, they have argued that the most effective way to counteract oppositional and traditional sexism is to refuse all gender and sexual identities, or to subvert those categories by doing gender in non-conventional ways, e.g., drag, androgyny, and so on. This again ignores the fact that we don't know. There are certain societal things that are predicated on like genetic expression. I can't think of one off the top of my head. For some reason, all I can think about is the fact that babies have accents the moment they come out of the womb, because they learn from listening to people outside the uterus talking, they develop the accent. So it's very hard to impossible to predict what exactly is innate to one's gender / biological sexual sex identity to one's what you've been socialized as. So she's constantly derailing against people who see gender as purely an aspect of socialization. I think that okay, this is going to be nuts, but I do think that gender has been determined by socialization, and I think there is no way that we can figure out just how much of it is a genetic expression, because we can't isolate people enough to break down that social component. I'm thinking about it, and literally just like, even if you stuck a mom with a boy and a girl twin and isolated her completely, she's still going to be affecting the babies while they're in utero, because she's going to be talking, she's going to be doing stuff. If she doesn't go insane from the social isolation first, she is going to be imprinting stuff onto those children, and you can't really pull back, because you'll eventually people go nuts when they are isolated for too long. So it's not only not ethical, but it's probably just impossible to ever fully pull those apart. But moving on. Many gender theorists and activists have embraced performance-centric models, praising these models' potential to free us from oppositional gender norms and to challenge the idea that straight genders are more legitimate than queer ones. But I see several problems with such theories. For one, such models display several of the flaws that regularly plague gender theories, which I described in detail at the end of Chapter 6, Intrinsic Inclinations, and we've gone over Chapter 6. Further, I believe that the central tenet of performance-centric models of gender, that social gender arises and is propagated by the way individuals do or perform gender, is problematic. She really is a sort of biological essentialism sort of person. And clearly, I have a problem with that because I don't think gender or sex is biologically essentialized. Many of us who have physically transitioned from one sex to the other understand that our perceived gender is typically not a product of our performance, i.e., gender expression/slash gender roles, but rather than our physical appearance, in particular, our secondary sex characteristics. This makes sense if you think about it. And I wrote, not really, because our physical appearances are shaped by how society sees our gender, which is why you can have third gendered people and maybe they get respected, maybe they don't, but in cultures that have more than two gender identities, you see there is still a shaping of what you would expect that person to look like. After all, if you look like a supermodel, you can act as butch as you want to, but other people will inevitably gender you as female. If you look like a linebacker, you can act as femme as you want, but others still gender you as male. I don't really have anything to say about that except it's really like, I don't, it's frustrating. Personally, I used to have a performance-centric view of gender when I was living as a male, when I used to cross-dress and pass as a woman in public. The amount of time and effort I had to put into altering my appearance and behaviors to accomplish that feat made it feel like a performance in many ways. But when I eventually did transition, I chose not to put on a performance. I simply acted, dressed, and spoke the way I always had, the way that felt most comfortable to me. And congratulations for you that you are able to eventually pass as a woman. But once again, we have this is my experience, I'm going to put this on everyone else. After being on female hormones for a few months, I found that people began to consistently gender me as female despite the fact that I was doing my gender the same way I always had. Again, congratulations, I've been on testosterone for over a year and I still get misgendered constantly. And in supermarket checkout lines, when the child in the cart ahead of me started smiling, talking to me, I found that I could interact with them without their mother becoming suspicious or fearful, which is what often happens in similar situations when I was perceived as male. Which is something that I'm shocked that she wrote that in there, because she is loath to talk about how stuff happens to men or trans men, and that is something that happens to men and trans men. I would argue that social gender is not produced and propagated because of the way we as individuals perform or do our genders. It lies in the perceptions and interpretations of others. I can modify my own gender all I want, but it won't change the fact that other people will continue to compulsively assign a gender to me and to view me as through the distorted lens of cissexual and heterosexual assumption. Which is the end of the chapter and my quotes. As you can see, while I did agree with her much more and stuff, there's a lot less notes than normal. It ends up breaking down at the end of the chapter. It ends up breaking down the moment she is like, gendering is an active, not a subconscious process. This entire chapter is cisgender people put their viewpoints on us, as she then puts her viewpoints on everyone else. And that's all I've got to say about that. Gender is an extremely complex combination of biology, social norms, evolution, and culture, which ties back into social norms. And that's why we are having people who are trying to challenge that and have been trying to challenge that. Like I said, women have not always been allowed to wear pants, and in many places they still aren't. Yeah, it's annoying just reading her experiences and her assuming that it's the same for everyone else when she's talking about cisgender, reading people's gender experiences and assuming it's the same as their own. So, yeah, that's all for me today. Thanks for waiting so long for this next chapter, but I'll try and be a little more frequent. I'm figuring things out slowly. But until next time, y'all have a great day. Bye. My brain broke. My brain broke, Nettle.